Welcome to Artemancer, a Latinx art and culture podcast. I'm your host, Mauricio Ramirez. In each episode, we dive deep into conversations with individuals who have left their mark on Latinx art. From visual artists to academics, cultural producers to activists, Artemancer is a space where we explore their stories, experiences, and the profound impact of their work. In today's episode, we explore the artistic journey of Josué Rojas, a Salvadoran-born American artist. Inspired by a passion for mural arts and graffiti, he joined Presida I's muralist at the age of 15. Upon graduating high school, Rojas pursued his artistic dreams, earning a BFA in painting and drawing from the California College of Arts and Crafts in 2004. And he also earned an MFA in painting from Boston University in 2015. From 2017 to 2021, Rojas was the executive director of the nonprofit Acción Latina, an organization that promotes cultural arts and houses the Spanish bilingual newspaper known as El Tecolote. Let's explore how Rojas is expanding the narrative of U.S. Central American contributions to the Latinx art scene. Welcome, Josué. How are you doing on this lovely day?
Hey, man, I am blessed. I am too blessed to be stressed on this beautiful day.
To start off this interview, I like to think about origin stories, and particularly your story, because it's so connected to San Francisco, to El Salvador, to a lot of the art you produce nowadays as a muralist, as an artist here in San Francisco. So I'm curious to know, what was your first encounter with visual art?
Man, firstly, thank you for having me, Mauricio, and it's a real pleasure to join you on this early moment of your podcast. I'm sure it's gonna blow up in no time. It's a good question. You know, what was my first sort of introduction to visual art? I mean, visual art and visual culture kind of permeates the city of San Francisco, and I was lucky enough to be positioned in a place, to have grown up in a place from my early years that really fed that. And so, you know, I think like any other kid, stuff like Ninja Turtles and Bart Simpson, you know, I'm a kid of the 80s, and I was about 9 years old when I remember, that t-shirt. There was a special t-shirt that you can get at like swap meets or like low-end stores of Ninja Turtles fighting Bart Simpson somehow. And it's like, you know, I think they had one where like MC Hammer was hanging out with Bart Simpson, and they had one where like, you know, and I just, you know, remember just that weird mashup. But that, you know, if I could, you know, like you have a fever dream, you remember a thing, it's usually not one image, but I do remember very clearly that Bart Simpson was my idol and the Ninja Turtles was my idol. And somehow MC Hammer was a soundtrack to it. But growing up in the Bay, like more seriously speaking, right in that, you know, cusp of 80s and 90s, it was really a lively time, certainly for murals in San Francisco, in the Mission District where I grew up in. But I specifically remember, you know, riding my bike around the Mission at about the age of, 10, 11, 12, what we call jumping off the porch, right? Right. Where your mom gives you permission to leave the house for more than a block or more than just the store. And I would go on my bike and ride around the neighborhood. And the 90s, the early 90s, the mid 90s were really notorious for graffiti in the Mission as well. And so I really am a reflection of that environment, you know, where traditional mural making met with, you know, urban and street art and graffiti, you know, where Mujeres Muralistas and Presida I's meet spaces where, you know, Reminisce and Twist and, you know, Barry McGee and some of these guys that was all happening at the same time. And so I feel pretty lucky to have been kind of the visual lay of the land, and also the soundtrack. The soundtrack was hip hop, you know, in its kind of golden era of my growing up.
So what were some of the first things you were drawing? Like, and do you remember like what age that would be?
Yeah, I remember distinctly getting in trouble when I was supposed to be doing math. I remember those numbers looked to me like little characters, so I turned my math homework into a whole story filled with like the page filled to the brim of art, and teacher, very swiftly let my mom know that wasn't gonna fly in her class. But yeah, I just remember, just also growing up in in the mission. We weren't rich. We were going to church every night. My mom made sure we went to church every single night or close to it. I just remember being bored out of my mind, but my mind wouldn't also let me be bored out of my mind because I was able to see all these different things in my head. I would see, these little scenes and these little stories I would make up. And so, I think having that kind of an expansive time to sort of let my mind wander and in this context of faith really kind of enveloped me as a kid. And yeah, it really influenced my later what I would describe as like my visual point of culture, my visual culture. Yeah.
Growing up in the city, how does graffiti play into sort of your timeline? Did you see it as like a, I don't know, like elementary school or middle school, and then try to replicate it back then, or was it till like high school where you were like into graffiti?
Yeah. Well, graffiti, you see it everywhere. You see it everywhere. You see it everywhere in San Francisco, whether it's just a scrawl on the wall, whether it's cholo riding. For me, that moment when I was riding that bike, I turned a corner and you would see your run of the mill graffiti, your cholo scrawls, your like, north side, south side stuff. But you turn a corner in the Mission in the 90s and you would see this big screw, or you would see, throw up by twist, or you would see a horse. And that was a little bit more than just like a stamp. It was kind of like this icon that like moved around and lived around in the city. And so I grew later to understand that the visual culture of San Francisco is unique. It's influential, and people want to come here to make a name and make visual art. But for me, it was just like always. It always was something where I saw other cities and was like, oh, this is also cool. But San Francisco is very, very unique. But to answer your question, me and my friends really, cinema really kind of changes your narrative. You're growing up, and right around that same time, I remember Dr. Dre's Chronic in '92, and Snoop Doggy Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style, in '93, and how that related to our neighborhoods. How that related to the sound of our neighborhoods, how that related to the Rodney King riots, and how we interpreted that as youngsters, in middle school here in San Francisco, was really, it was a swag, it was a vibe, it was a look. Even the artwork on the Doggy Style, it was very, very different. It was a comic, but it was its own thing. And so we really absorbed that as young men growing up. I grew up in the Mission, but I grew up on the Potrero side of the Mission. So my formative years were deeply informed by the Potrero neighborhood of that era, which, was, if you know San Francisco, it's got the project side, right? It's got the sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out within the Mission, but it's also, I guess that would be technically the east side of the Mission. And then it's got the Potrero side. And to make this... to make that pot even more interesting, of brown kids, black kids, Pacific Islander kids, to make that pot even more interesting, we had the kids from Treasure Island. So Treasure Island was a military base in the 90s when I was growing up. And so they would ship the kids, they would bus those kids into San Francisco to go to school. And usually those were what was the nearest schools to the Bay Bridge. It was Potrero Hill Middle School, and the high school was likely Galileo. So we get all these kids. And those were all military families at that point. So there was this big mix, but a lot of white kids and a lot of black kids and a lot of just mixed, Islander kids and Latino kids, but they were all military. And so we grew up in this really kind of a very interesting space. So back to the culture of Snoop Dogg. I mean, this is the 90s. I remember we really wanted to emulate what we heard. And we really wanted to emulate what we saw. And what we were seeing in cinema was things like American Me, and more importantly, almost more of the one that had the biggest imprint was this movie called Blood In, Blood Out, which somehow has two names. They call it Blood In, Blood Out, but we called it Bound by Honor. It was the first time when it came out. You could probably check them out under both names. But it was written by, the famous poet Baca, what was his name? I just know his name is Baca. And it was amazing. It was just an amazing story that we kind of emulated. Even the art, the look, and the feel of that is kind of what was my intro to it. So that kind of cholo vibe, and we weren't really gangsters, but we were definitely a clique. There was a group of young men that we all kind of gravitated toward the neighborhood, and the biggest thing that I could really remember was drawing those cholo cartoons and drawing those cholo kind of clowns and that kind of jailhouse art. One of the things that I learned later, in my art formation, is the power of being able to achieve gray. So the power of something like a pencil and how many different shades of gray can you achieve, and the way that relates, the translation to that in urban culture, in Latino culture, right, in this very male culture that I grew up in, was ballpoint pens, right? And so those things like making art on a kerchief, with a ballpoint pen, things like making a letter that's being sent from prison back home, having that be as beautiful as possible. And so, it was just these hours, people spending hours with a quill, what they would call a ballpoint pen. And so I learned to sort of master that. I try to emulate these styles, drawing this kind of tattoo looking art. And I kind of, that was like these are my very early evolution, like the elements that added to my evolution as a creative. Witnessing murals, the visual and cinematic culture of the neighborhood that I grew up in, and the sound,
Cool. So all three, right? All three sort of elements formed. So I think it's important to point out, for those unfamiliar of maybe the Mission District, that there's already sort of this lengthy history of murals and cultural production and art being created by a mix of folks. I mean, you could say a big chunk of them are Latinx, Latino, some coming from the Chicano movement, but also a very diverse group of people that are just sort of like coming in from different parts of Latin America as well, calling the Mission District in San Francisco their home, remaining there, or eventually sort of going back. And here I'm sort of being intentional and thinking about people from maybe Nicaragua or El Salvador or Chile, Central Americans, who've arrived even before there were civil wars, right? There's already this connection between San Francisco and, say, Central America via the coffee trade. And so, but you have this cultural activism part as well, right? So you have already a demographic, a population of Latinos or people from Latin America in San Francisco, in the Mission District, say like around 1960s and onwards. And then you have these cultural movements like Chicano movement, the civil rights movement, that hits so hard here in San Francisco in the Bay Area. When I think about the Third World Strikes movements and other movements at San Francisco State, right, led by really college students. But in the end, it creates all these sort of important places that I can think about that are Latino cultural institutions, right? So like Acción Latina, Presida Eyes Muralist, Mission Cultural Center, the list is pretty lengthy. So specifically, I want to know, like, how did that culture that was already sort of set in place and you sort of going into it, right, as someone who's like a young artist during that time, 80s, 90s, right? How did that impact you? And if you could talk a little bit about the influence of Presida Eyes Muralist, right, as one of these institutions that also contributes, I know, to your formation as an artist.
Absolutely. As you were speaking and I was remembering those years, I remember I remember a couple things, and I think the material is never too far from the creative. And so sometimes you're gonna just make things with what you've got, you know. And so what was really again available and prevalent and around for me wasn't painting right away. Although I did get very lucky, and I got exposed to painting a little bit early, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. It had to do with not being able to afford markers and my mom giving me a watercolor set. I would get a lot of my art materials from spaces like garage sales, get some used art materials that my mom would somehow procure. And that generally was something that I played with and experimented with. But aside from the material, like I think culturally, just kind of seeing something like I really distinctly remember being with this group of young men, and we had like a little La Raza club at Potrero Hill, and really that's how we educated ourselves. The person who sort of helped us, take that out, bring that out off the ground was John Gallardo, who's a staple in the mission. If you guys know, the San Francisco Lowrider Council, he's deeply involved. He's deeply involved with the Mission Hub, the Mission Food Hub on 19th and Alabama. Anyway, at that point, he was a very young man, and we were kids, and he really wanted us to learn our own history and our own culture. And I remember us marching during the walkouts, the 90s walkouts, and we quickly realized that it wasn't just us kids on the Potrero side of the mission walking out. There were these kids from James Lick, which is a little bit of a different mission brown Latino experience. And there were these kids from Horace Mann, which was a little bit different. Then the kids in the Excelsior, which was completely different because the demographics were different. And so we would walk out and we would see, and I still remember like looking at the fashion, looking at the clothes of what we were wearing then, like the Big Ben Davis, things like huaraches, instead of being something that you were like ashamed of, something that you were proud of wearing, right? Our teams even, right? The Niners and the Raiders, stuff like this. But the image that most stands out in my mind is a poster that people had, and it was an indigenous man pointing his finger in your face and saying, who do you think you're calling an illegal alien, pilgrim? And of course, click, without having like a master's in indigenous history, without understanding the way that this country has dealt with native or black or, dark-skinned folks historically, that image just synthesized and clicked it, made it all click in my mind. It says, yeah, that is a really good question, And where do I stand? I mean, it's really confrontational, right? It's putting its finger in your face. And I just remember seeing that and it affecting me. And I swear it spoke to me in the way that I thought that image was started in the 90s. That image came from the 90s. We brought that image out, right? Everyone feels like throughout history that's like your image. I think that's the power of art. But later I learned and got to meet the artist, Yolanda Lopez, who put that together and who that piece is a true reflection of. That piece really speaks for a lot of people in the Latino community as a whole. But also, if you know Yolanda, that's a very Yolanda piece in that it's deeply committed to activism. It's deeply confrontational. It's deeply intelligent, and that combination of art is very potent. And I think that I'm bringing that up, and I spent all that time to sort of describe that moment because as a kid, that was something I never forgot. And it's still something that I strive to achieve in my artwork. So, I mean, I'm talking to you about one individual, which is Yolanda Lopez. But really, when you say Yolanda Lopez, you're also talking about Los Siete de la Raza, right? And what is her contribution to that group that galvanized the Mission District? And we wouldn't have the Mission District as we know it now without those contributions in that historical moment. And then if you're speaking about Los Siete de la Raza, you can't also mention that without speaking about the Black Panthers, right? And what's that imprint upon the Bay Area, the greater Bay Area, and the greater United States and the political movements. And then, so to have all of that sort of, this sort of this tree, right? This family tree of activism and art. To have that expression come and be burned and tattooed in my mind is something that I'll never forget. And of course, I have a equally potent example for Presida Eyes, right? In the murals of Balmy Alley. I have an equally potent example for graffiti, right? In with people like Barry McGee, Twist, Spy, right? Spy was ubiquitous, right? Why was Spy putting up 1492, with a copyright? Which is already like, what? You know what I mean? Just that alone, right? 1492. On every possible surface, from elevator shafts to muni buses to, really big on walls at Balboa High School to, and it was right during that, I forget what anniversary it was, several centuries, like 500th anniversary from 1492, right? In 1992, right? And so the politics of art is really something that, people have found a way to take and make their own and bring those expressions, even as micro expressions or as huge, enormous expressions. I mean, I can go on. You could write books and record hours and hours and hours just about Presida Eyes, right? How did Presida Eyes contribute by, simply putting up the murals that they were putting up, by carrying on the legacy of Mujeres Muralistas, right? Having a woman-centered, woman-first, woman-led projects. Of course, it didn't exclude males or people who identified as other, right? But it was certainly woman-led, right? And Susan Cervantes and Juana Alicia, the list goes on and on. But what did that mean for young people that were coming up? And certainly, the early graffiti classes that were at Presida Eyes that were offered with guys like Francisco Claim and others, and then it becoming the urban youth arts class, taking that name on with Estria, and I remember assisting him during that class. And I was in the room when that name sort of congealed and formulated. Those kind of projects, that kind of education, I would learn later in art school that you don't just get that. You don't just get that in art school. They don't just teach you how your own culture, particularly as an immigrant or an immigrant growing up in the mission, how that connects to, works of art. And that's something that, at least for me, I learned by seeing its impact. I learned by feeling its impact viscerally in myself. And I learned by understanding it, having it go click, and then, I don't know, feeling compelled, essentially feeling the need to participate. And so, I said it again. I said it once, I'll say it again. It's just very lucky to sort of be within a space and time that I grew up in.
Yeah, so likewise, I was also sort of a recipient of Presida Eyes, right? I was also a student for a couple years in high school, and I think that those were pretty informative years for me. But you don't experience it until you experience it, right? So, yeah, I agree with you. It's like feeling that sensation of painting a mural with community members or for I don't know, for a certain specific site location. And amongst other artists that are maybe around your age or more experienced, right? That's also where I think a lot of mentoring happens. You were talking about Estria and, how important that sort of organization is, right? Presida Eyes and how many murals has produced, right? Exactly what you said. Like there's a whole history there that's largely gone, probably not written or documented maybe as it should be, but, there's a wealth of history there. And I think those who have participated in Presida Eyes know the strength and the power behind creating murals in community, right? Very community-based sort of organization, community-based murals. So thank you for sharing that, because this sort of brings me up into the more present, I guess, of thinking about, okay, so your past and how, the Mission District and sort of just being, alive in the 90s and 80s, right? There's a lot of art and culture, and I think the Mission District was going through so much. I mean, when we think about sort of gentrification already starting to creep up in the 90s. Um, and I know you don't produce this exhibition, so we're kind of jumping ahead, but this is more of my sort of personal connection to Josué, is talking about this exhibition he created in 2016 at Acción Latina's Juan R. Fuentes Gallery. And this was an interesting moment, I think, for San Francisco and even the Mission District, because again, we had gone through other waves of gentrification, but by 2015, you start seeing this other sort of insidious sort of gentrification happening in the Mission District that got me really interested, because I was now, older and adult, and seeing like how ironic that many of these apartment buildings were going up in flames, right, during this era. And how many people, this is when tech was really starting to go, full out. Well, maybe, arguably 2012, 2013, right? The iPhone comes in and sort of changes the whole landscape of what startup tech companies are, and just, tech companies in general. And San Francisco and the Silicon Valley being sort of the hub or the center, the epicenter for these tech companies. So we see the Mission District being this place, this neighborhood where a lot of people are being displaced, right? By big money, by people, buying up houses. And rents just being jacked up, right, through the roof, and people are being displaced. It seems like that sort of decade of 2010, even now to 2020, is like, this whole era of really this sort of profound change of, this sort of big tech money coming in and changing just the Bay Area in general, not just San Francisco, but you feel it throughout, the whole Bay Area, right? People are moving, further out to get more affordable houses or rent, right? And then maybe working here and having to be, these sort of mega commuters. All these sort of instances that I could talk about. But in 2016, you create Gentromancer. So I'd like to know sort of the inspiration behind Gentromancer, and also what your just overall inspiration behind it, because I think it's such a clever name. If you could explain the name, right, Gentromancer, and I'm not so sure if it's supposed to be in Spanish or English, but I thought it was a very clever way to sort of create this narrative, right, and this story behind this whole exhibition. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. That really thought out and question. I mean, it's just so loaded. How do you relate? How do you talk about this? How can you, begin to talk about the idea of gentrification? And some people think like, oh, it's just cities change. It's just like a natural evolution. Why are you so opposed to this? And it's just like, well, I'm speaking to the unnatural parts of this. It wasn't natural at that moment, right? I had just spent 2 years, a whole lifetime between, firstly, since the question, the last question and this question, a lifetime had passed. I had gone to grad school. I had lived and worked as a journalist for many years. I ultimately, got my master's in art, and I really wanted to speak about what was happening with art, in a way that kind of hadn't, at least I was trying to do it in a way that hadn't been done before. And I really was taken aback. I always loved sci-fi, and I was listening to, truth be told, Gentromancer came from a line in Deltron 3030. And he was talking about, he's talking about like, this like sci-fi post-apocalyptic running through the city with like on a run with the handgun. He says something like that. He's like running from robots, and he's like, doing this post-apocalyptic sort of, I don't know, like a neo noir like chase scene or something. He paints this picture that's epic in my mind, and I'm just like, how do I talk about gentrification is my question. And he said Neuromancer, and I remembered the book by William Gibson. I was like, of course, Neuromancer, right? And I remember the idea of like a mancer is like speaks to, right? So a necromancer speaks to the dead, right? Which is like the sort of idea that people have talked about before. Or a neuromancer is from the William Gibson's sort of post, was it cyberpunk kind of, actually it's kind of the beginning of cyberpunk. It's like the cyberpunk novel and the idea of uploading. Right, he's the first one to kind of talk these phrases that we now know. He was like imagining uploading your consciousness, your brain. And so I was reading the book and thinking about it, and I was like, all right, you know what? I want to be able to speak to gentrification, and I need to do it in this creative way, and I need to bring people along with me. And so I thought of the idea of Gentromancer, the idea of like basing things off of a book, which is also something that really helps me as an artist. I went from being the kind of kid, that never really liked books to really one that really loved books and had books with me at all times. And so even now in my art, I try to base a lot of what I do on text. Anyway, the idea is that I'd like to speak to gentrification as if it were this entity, if it were a monster. And I brought along with me people to help. So I had several poets from the poet laureate to kids that were in juvenile hall through the Beat Within. My good friend David Inocencio, rest in peace. He did a workshop where he asked young kids in juvenile hall about their thoughts about gentrification, and then everything in between. So we got from the poet laureate to kids in juvenile hall to like established mission poets. And so we published those in El Tecolote next to some of my art, and a lot of the art in Gentromancer really was inspired by some of this poetry. So Gentromancer for me really is a collaborative piece with a lot of different writers. And really, I just needed to be able to speak to this moment. I think it's really hard to talk about the change of your community, right? Seeing it, growing up in a place and loving it, being connected to it deeply, having it be your first memories, and then to see some of those things slowly kind of fade and people sort of slowly go away, little by little. That thing, this used to be that, this place used to be an ice cream parlor, that used to be a bar, that used to be a restaurant, and now it's whatever it is, right? And that those feelings are alienating and painful, and and they started to build in me this need to talk about it, and I was really, really upset about it. I would walk around the neighborhood hyperventilating, and it was just very difficult. And so art for me was really the way to speak about this. And this expression through the Gentromancer kind of collection of works really was cathartic and therapeutic and empowering for me as an artist. And really, I think helped launch a lot of different things that came afterwards for me, both in leadership of the mission community, the mission arts community, and then professionally as an artist and also as a local activist. And so I'm really grateful to Acción Latina. I mean, the other thing is, Acción Latina's Juan R. Fuentes Gallery really stepped up, showcasing, young mission kind of upcoming artists like myself at that point, and as well as masters, masters like Calixto Robles and Juana Alicia, and again, the list goes on, right? And so it was really a really amazing opportunity for me to really be able to put that piece together. And so, yeah.
Yeah, the way I see it, to me, it's kind of like an ode to San Francisco, to the Mission District, of what was, happening at that moment. And so for me, it was like such an eye-opening exhibition, right? That had a clear theme, but I really like the fact that you brought in people, community members, and you had this sort of poetry side. And for those who don't know, like, it was part of the broadside, right, in one of the El Tecolote newspapers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
so
yeah.
All of that to me was just like, this is more than just like a normal sort of art show. I think it was very sort of community centered. And to me, that's what made it so powerful and impactful, right? In thinking about, what an artist can do with, say, not necessarily a mural, right? Because I think that's something you've done, and we'll talk about that, and you're sort of comfortable with. But how an art exhibition, right, can also speak to these forms of gentrification when we think about sort of art activism via, paintings and on top of that with amazing skill, right? Like, so you had just come sort of back from doing your master's, right? And yeah, to me, it just becomes this sort of a critical moment, I think, also in your own trajectory, right? Um, and the way I see it is just, producing art that is considered fine art when we think about paintings, right? But with a very specific theme to it, right? Of sort of this, again, like I said, our activist approach of calling to something that's really insidious and violent at the same time. And we've spoke about this before, right? When we think about people getting displaced, right? When their rent hikes up more than 100%. And then those who actually passed away, right? When we think about people who died in these fires that happened. And that gets really murky, right? When we think about, arson, and these could have been motivations of landlord arson. And so all of that to me was really profound as well. I was a grad student at Santa Cruz, doing my PhD. And it was just like, man, this is, Josué is also coming from this background that he's also from Central America, right? We haven't talked about this, but it's well known, right? You came at a young age, fleeing the Salvadoran civil wars, and so for me as well, it's like my parents were fleeing the wars. So thinking about that idea, and we've talked about this again before, of being displaced several times, and how Latinx or Latino communities, right, are being displaced, maybe from their home countries who arrive in the Mission District, but again being displaced because of this other sort of gentrifying, for the most part, fueled moment in the Bay Area. So yeah, to me, I think anyone, check this exhibition out. It's on Josué's website, josuerojas.com, right? Is it Josué?
JosueRojasArt.com.
JosueRojasArt.com. If you want to check out more images, I know El Tecolote, Acción Latina has some of those photographs as well. Anyone that's from the Bay Area, I hope you check out this exhibition that was in 2016 by Josué Rojas at Acción Latina's Juan R. Fuentes Gallery. So speaking about that, moving on, because you were there. I know your trajectory afterwards. You're executive director of Acción Latina for a couple of years. And then this sort of pivotal moment happens where you stop your duties at Acción Latina, and then you become sort of this full-time artist, and you get a lot of commissions to create murals. And this is also granted during the pandemic, right? So I'm curious to know where that sort of, maybe if you want to speak about it, the internal switch of moving on, right, from executive director to full-time artist, but also the motivation to just create art during this era of the pandemic, but you're continuing to push murals at a really sort of high level in two ways, the way that I see it, right? In terms of production, because you've created quite a bit, right, of murals since, that's 2020, but also the level of artistry. But then you've also had some of these collaborative murals that I find also sort of fascinating, right? That are sort of, you invite more people in that are doing graffiti, and some more graffiti based murals, but then you also have like other murals that are very specific to culture, and there's maybe too many to go about, right? Because I love the Yolanda Lopez mural, and we were talking about Yolanda Lopez earlier, and that mural to me is fascinating to see, as someone who's such an icon in the art world in general, right? Obviously Chicano movement, but also just, I think now, Yolanda Lopez is, there's just a lot that I think people will, if they don't know, who Yolanda Lopez is, I think they will in the upcoming years. I'd hope more people sort of know about the work of Yolanda Lopez. So yeah, if you could just speak about, the sort of the murals that you've been creating.
Yeah. I think in times of crisis, people go to what really is elemental. What really is the building blocks of their life. And for me, it really has been murals. It really has been painting. I always kind of say this, that there's this myth that artists need to be locked up in some dungeon somewhere, and their studio is this torture chamber, and you're by yourself, and you got to cut your ear off to make some good work. And I've grown up painting. It's always been outside with friends in the sun, with good music and some good food, and it's a vibe. And so I really, I guess, went to that, when 2020 hit, and we had those really wild, a wild consecutive bit of events where we had those really big fires in California. I remember waking up and it was an orange day. It was very odd to have an orange day. It was the grimmest, weirdest,
It was apocalyptic.
apocalyptic kind of
end the
moment,
world.
right? And I don't know why. I was like, I need to go paint. We need to go paint. And my wife's like, well, you can't be out there. And I was like, well, I'm already wearing a mask for my respiration. Like, why can't I go out there? So I did. We did. And I organized a bunch of artists and we did. And, just buildings that were, abandoned, spaces that are kind of forgotten. I started just to, organize and organize and organize, and I get people to go and paint with me. And I got everybody from kids that are up and coming, to, again, and just friends that like to paint, to legendary graffiti artists like Vogue and Ghana, who was a former student of mine, to to just completely just go and paint the town. And it's been really, really special. Something very special happens when people get together and do creative work. I think one of the best gifts I've ever been given in my life is for someone to be able to tell me, hey, listen, you can be an artist. Like, that was a very magic moment. And so to be able to be there and witness that moment and to sort of instigate it with other people, with other young artists, with other non-artists, it's really important to me. It's where I sort of get my my gratification. It's really important to me to sort of pass this on. I may not have children yet, but this is one of the ways that I pass on my sort of legacy. And so in the same way that baton was handed to me, right? We're talking about Yolanda Lopez and the Susan Cervantes and the Juan Alicias. And so, I'm a very living carrier of this, and I have that very intentional, not just murals, for the record, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people in California doing murals. There's people doing these really fun, and I'm not dissing anybody, right? All this fun kind of eye candy stuff and really cool looking imagery. And, it's like the street art movement, like more power to all the different artists. And I am a participant of also that. But I am also a carrier of particularly the mission flavor and the mission vibe, the mission sort of look and feel, the mission tradition of art making. And so that is where I really want to sort of continue to sort of contribute while I'm able to. And so, I felt kind of an urgency, as I left Acción Latina. I just kind of knew that it was a moment for me to just step into something different. I didn't want to anymore. I didn't want to any longer be sort of an arts administrator. I really wanted to be an artist. That's what I went to school for. That's what my life seemingly has been building up to, evidently has been building up to, and I really want to just continue to do that. And so, that's what I've been trying to do since I left Acción Latina in 2021 till now, which is 2024. I really want to really put out an output that really honors the legacy of all the sort of elements and ingredients that have gone into where we are now.
So, all right. So this next question is regarding your sort of Central American identity, and this is something we both share. I'm Central American, or identify as, I don't know. There's so many names I could go by, right? Salvadoran American, Central American. If we wanted to be like Maya Chinchilla and her poem, Central American, right? So many sort of names and identifiers I could sort of call myself as a Central American. But again, my parents are from El Salvador. I was born and raised here in San Francisco, in a city that has so many Central Americans and this sort of rich Central American history that I didn't even know about. And I beg to differ. Well, I would just almost bet that a lot of folks that are from here probably don't know that there's this really long history of Central Americans in San Francisco. And I know that because I've done the research, right? But, as this is something that I think we, connect with, is our Central American identity. And I think that's sort of important because, especially in art, not to be overshadowed by other movements, but I feel like when we talk about California, when we talk about San Francisco, the Chicano movement is something that's usually written about or maybe just associated with San Francisco and California. And I think we're at a moment that it's we're looking at history and we're looking at people who've produced art in the 80s, even late 70s, right? We see Central Americans are creating artworks in San Francisco. And there's, that's kind of part of my sort of mission as well, is like thinking about how Central American art sort of intervenes into this idea of Latino art largely, right? U.S. Latino art and artists that are creating in the U.S., right, in the United States. Um, but we can't talk about that without talking about the important connections with Central America as well, right? As immigrants, really, as people who've moved to the United States. So I think that's something important, and that's something you take up in your work, right? A lot is the Central American identity, the Central American experience, right? Central American motifs and signifiers and icons that become very apparent for those who might know about Central American culture. And so for me, that interests me about you. And you continue to create these artworks that are closely aligned to your own identity as a Central American. So if you could talk a bit about, the artwork in relations to Central America or to your own sort of connection to Central America.
Absolutely, yeah. Growing up Central American, it's like it's Latino. It is, and you're like in San Francisco, at least in the Mission. You're growing up was very much within a Chicano context, right? So, it's I know a lot of Central Americans that identify as Chicanos, and a lot of Chicanos that have a lot of best friends and chosen family that are Central American, and so I think that's one of the things that really makes, again, the Mission unique. And if I go back to even those moments that we started in the interview, where it's like I was a youngster growing up, we were not a monolith. We were a group of young people. We were a single group, but within that, there was just such a shade of the Latino and Central American, the Chicano experience. And so, I think it's important. In the words of Guillermo Gomez Pena, that we make our own icons and we continue to build and make our own imagery, our own sort of our language, right? Yes to everything from the Frida and the Diego imagery. Why not? Of course, but we can still evolve, and there's a lot more. And that at this point is about 100 years old. Some of those images.
Yeah,
we don't. So, and the Day of the Dead stuff, I mean, I'm all about it. Let's go for it, but these things are also getting co-opted and used in a certain way. So I really think not only are we ripe for continuing to make new images, and I was starting to say that, there's a group of people that are coming up and they identify in all these variety of myriads of ways, right? Like even Central America isn't like a monolith, right? Growing up Central American, it's like, okay, like I met some people in Boston that are Central American that had a very interesting take. Folks in LA, in Miami, here in the Bay Area, there's this very, it's a very varied and powerful shade of expression that we all have. And so the BIPOC folks and the LGBTQ experience, it's all seeing this really powerful moment of expression. And I think it's just really great to sort of see all of the different sort of flavors that people are able to put out. As for me, I just really want to continue to evolve. I think as an artist, you're either moving or you're not, and I really want to sort of still be at the vanguard and the forefront of the kind of imagery and the kind of communication that is still yet to be done, right, within art. Within art school, people always say, painting is dead. I grew up people saying painting is dead, and I was like, I still feel like there's a lot for me to say, and I feel that the medium is not dead, and I feel that as it evolves, and even as our cultures evolve, there's moments here to document, there's moments here to talk about, and there's a lot of talk of futurism. Why not? Why can't we talk about Central American presence within this context of gentrification, within this context of post gentrification, in a complicated space like San Francisco, and again, in pushing forward towards the future, I'm a part of the generation that came during the war, and I couldn't have imagined what was waiting for me here, to be able to get an education, 2 degrees in art, to be able to influence the culture, to be able to speak to the younger generations coming up, speak directly to the themes and speak directly with the people who are experiencing those themes. Like the Balmy Alley mural that I was very blessed to be able to do back in 2014 is when I completed it. It's due for restoration. It's 10 years. I was really inspired by the people who were doing caravan work and the young people who were coming up on coming up from Central America on caravans and on top of what we call the beast, right, the train, and being inspired by the people, actual true people who are in San Franciscans who experience that migration story of coming up from Central America on the tops of a train or as a caravan. And, now I was this last summer I met a young man from Guatemala who's a brilliant young communicator and hungry, just absolutely hungry to communicate, hungry to make artwork. And, basically said, I'll paint with you. And I was like, yeah, please come on. He became my mentee. And he's not exactly of the caravan sort of migration, but he's of that same time period. Mm-hmm. And so now seeing this young person's interests, right, which are not unlike, he's 20 years old now, 19, 20. He's not unlike what my interests were when I was his age, right? So cartoons and graffiti and, participating in this very fertile and alive sort of environment that we have here in the Bay Area, this creative sort of look and feel, and just kind of being able to steer that energy to help him harness that power, make him better at communicating, make him better at, using the skills of an artist, and to make him better. It really is a full circle moment for me, and it really sort of injects me with energy to be able to sort of affect that culture. It's like being alive all over again, and sort of to see that. And so all that to say, it's a very intentional sort of speaking into the future. I think we need to continue to sort of believe. We need to sort of continue to have hope. And, you don't know who you're affecting by making some of this work, for every person that, for every time I'm out in the streets and, you're dealing with all these, if you want to see some weird stuff, you want to see some wild activities, stand on any street corner in San Francisco for an extended amount of time and you'll see some stuff happening, right? It's like our cities are becoming wilder and wilder almost by the day, it feels like. But that's what we sort of deal with as muralists, And to see that and to see people kind of dismissive, it's like, all right, another mural, another person making artwork. But for every, couple hundred, or I'm not even know what the number would be, but for every so often, some people comes up and they'll say, hey, listen, like what you did really speaks to me. I'll get a phone call every once in a while. So I'll do a thing and, we'll sometimes we'll do a dedication and people will come and bless it and burn some sage and do some danza. And sometimes people won't, sometimes people, there's a big minimum of murals of mine that have been blessed and dedicated and they get that sort of treatment. A lot of times you just complete a mural and you go home, and I don't know, all the ceremony I get is to treat myself to like a nice meal afterwards and a hot shower and, go to bed, because you're so tired. But just to get that phone call and someone say, hey, listen, what you did really made me feel seen, made me feel alive, made me feel that we're here, that means a lot to me. And to have a young person with me witnessing that moment and contributing to that moment is all the more powerful. And so I really want to keep doing that. I really want to keep putting out exhibitions. I have one coming up this year at the Incline Gallery. Which I don't know. I don't even know what the title is going to be, but maybe, I think just seeing what Gentromancer meant, maybe we need to revamp some of that, some of those ideas, So yeah, I think, nothing, here, but to keep on keeping on and really, yeah, I really do feel that, yes, my audience are, Central Americans and people who identify that way, but also my audience is, just really anybody who's on this journey that we call life. Like I told you, I happen to have come from the corner of the world that is El Salvador, that is Central American. I came to this corner of the world as a child, as a baby, really, and I represent this corner of the world because it's given me so much. But if there's something in there that has value, then it's also yours, and I want people to sort of extract that and have that and feel that it's theirs. And yeah, I mean that's just kind of the spirit of being an artist, right? The biggest gift that was ever given to me was from my mentor, John Walker, who's a British man, but he and I connected pretty deeply when I was in Boston. He was my professor, and he said if you're he said you won't be a very good artist unless you're generous, you know. And so I'm always trying to push my own envelope, of what I give and how much I give and how I can become more generous and truly be a better artist in that sense. And so I really believe in that. I believe in people, and I think people will pick that up and hopefully pay it forward, and continue with the spirit of giving, even when it's not Christmas.
Well, I'm thinking about all the great sort of diversity of murals you've created, because obviously I'm thinking about the more recent ones, is thinking about, Sean Monterrosa, for example. Like, those are murals, sort of picking back on what you were saying, like, that get celebrated. But then as an artist, you also create sort of other murals that maybe, nobody necessarily celebrates afterwards, but then you don't ever really know the impact it has on other people because you're not there, in the public. You're not that, random person, I guess, just walking by, and we don't know how those murals are affecting them, right? When we think about murals in terms of how they impact the public and individuals, really, that's hard to gauge, right? We don't necessarily know that. And then also, it's not like people are necessarily, seeking out the artist, to say thank you, or, this image specifically impacted me in this specific way when you, created this. And, so that's also the power of art. And that's also the power of public art, which I think this is something that is just sort of embedded in all the, diverse murals you've created throughout the decades, really. I mean, you were talking about 2014, right? And that mural on Enrique's journey in Central America. We don't know how many people that's impacted, but it's in, really public, Balmy Alley, a really public space in San Francisco. And we don't know who that's speaking to, right? We don't know the young, maybe, recent immigrant that understands where that image is coming from and how that's speaking to them. Or, somebody that might have migrated here, the same way Enrique did. So, to that effect, I think a lot of your murals and work you're doing is so sort of important on various levels. But I think there's this, if we can get something out of Josué, it's the humanity you bring to a lot of these murals. Obviously not all of them. I mean, like you have, your more graffiti based ones, but, I think about Yolanda, I think about, victims of gentrification, people who've passed away, and you sort of amplify, that person. And yeah, we make them, I mean, like you said, you make them our icons, right? Like, and I think that's really sort of powerful, but it speaks to sort of the images and the art you create is thinking about how do we create these sort of icons, right? Through images and through murals, and how important that is really when we think about, those who view them, because we don't really know how we're affecting them. But that humanity is present in all of your work. And even your paintings, your more recent exhibitions that I've seen, right? Sort of encapsulate that humanity of just diverse experiences, right? Not just Central American, like you said, not just Latino, right? It could be like an American experience. And so I just want to thank you for all the work you've done and you're continuing to do. I mean, to me, it's really exciting to have you at this moment, but I continue to be sort of excited for the future because I know there's just more sort of creative work in the works. And I think your skill is just going to continue sort of improving. You're going to refine yourself as an artist. I mean, You already have, to me, one of I think why I'm so sort of attracted to your work is that there is this high level of mastery already there, right? You've been through school, and you've painted for decades. So I just to sort of sum that up is the sort of excitement I see in the future murals, future paintings, future whatever Josué decides to sort of encounter. I'm really excited because I just know that Josué has this really creative spirit and energy that he puts towards, and a deliberate intention. And I think that's important, right? I think a lot of artists, and maybe just people in general, is like, when you think about intentions and goals, Josué, I think, has that in him, and it's reflected upon his artwork. So thank you for being the artist you are. Thank you for doing this journey. I just want to sort of celebrate and congratulate Josué on his journey of being an artist, and I hope that the audience sort of gets to see, check out Josué's artwork online or in person. It's really sort of great to see, I think, art in person for those of you who might not, go and see art in person, to see these murals in the flesh, right? You always get a different perspective. Just also thinking about architecture and being in certain places and spaces. To go check out murals, to me, is something sort of fascinating. There's this sort of awe-inspiring moment when you're in front of something, as opposed to just seeing it on your screen or, on your phone, a photograph of something. I do encourage, folks to go check out murals in person. So thank you, Josué, for being here. Any last words or, any last words?
No, just a deep gratitude. I'm just very grateful for this moment. Thank you, Mauricio, for kind of your insights and your ability to sort of synthesize a lot of information, a lot of history in a way that people can really grasp. And so, likewise, man, just really grateful and happy to be here and happy to be a part of this. So, gracias.
Thank you. All right, that wraps up our episode here with Josué Rojas. Check him out at josuerojasart.com. So josuerojasart.com. It's probably the best way you can find Josué Rojas' art, but also on social media if you want.
Yeah, my Instagram is really simple. It's just my name. It's just josue.rojas.art. And I'll be there.
Check him out. All right, thank you.
Bendiciones.